Following the release of Elden Ring Night Reign in 2025, getting somewhat controversial feedback from its audience, at least for a From Software title, I found my interest in Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree emerging once again, as a controversial release seems familiar. On my personal feelings, Elden Ring is a game that I can never permanently step away from, and this is due to what this game does so well, like its world and level design, its art and mythology, and of course the gameplay and the bosses. In my opinion, it set the bar higher than ever before for what makes a video game an actual masterpiece, a term I feel is thrown around way more than it actually should be, but not for Elden Ring or any game of that matter that matches its perfection and ambition. During my first playthrough, I felt similar to how I did when first exploring Breath of the Wild world when it first came out. An enormous amount to explore, with a freedom that seemed alien to the gaming world before this game's existence, and perhaps most importantly, a certain charm that not many games can replicate. And since then, Elden Ring is the closest game to ever getting to that feeling for me. So when Shadow of the Erdtree released in June of 2024, I was reasonably excited for such a seemingly large and ambitious expansion. I completed its main story in about a week, and it was fantastic. I even have an unscripted but excited video of me talking about my initial thoughts on it, in which I give really high praise. It was another FromSoft 10 out of 10, except it wasn't.
The world bosses are mostly reused bosses from the main game or reskins.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of tryhards who complain about it, but mixed reviews on Steam is pretty rare for an objectively well-made game, even if it is a DLC for an existing game.
The barren open world, the overly punishing boss design, and the insulting repetition of the same bosses and enemies all over the map.
Certainly the people valuing it as a combat challenge and praising its boss design would not be satisfied with the conclusion that it's Skyrim, but with somewhat more robust combat mechanics.
But I've had enough of this game design approach. I would not recommend this DLC to any of my friends as entertainment, but I could recommend it as a dare.
The reaction to this DLC was inconsistent. Granted, not bad by any means, but nowhere near reflective of past success in the Souls series when it comes to fan consensus. To be more specific, it was semi-review bombed for performance issues or unimpressive optimization, and for being too hard, at least when it first came out. In my opinion, Shadow of the Erdtree is really close to what one would call another flawless triumph in gaming, but falls short in the long run for lots of people due to reductive stagnation. Which prior to my first playthrough of this DLC was something I had never associated with a game or DLC that might otherwise be considered a masterpiece. On paper, Shadow of the Erdtree, despite only being DLC, is theoretically more ambitious than any piece of Souls content we've ever seen. It is clearly set to succeed and always was going to, but in the safest way possible. A style of game development that's more guaranteed in quality rather than risk-taking. Yet, while this all sounds repugnant, there is an argument to be made that it may not even be worth discussing for a mere DLC, as maybe our expectations aren't in line with FromSoft's real vision. I believe that they did work insanely hard on making this DLC as good as they could, and I disagree with anyone that thinks the devs were lazy in crafting a new world. I also think it's a fair assessment that the Souls franchise as a whole wouldn't be described as consistently innovative by the majority of the fans of this series, or in other words, it's not Zelda. But I don't even know if this in of itself is fair to them, as it's true that From has been experimenting much more recently. I mean, if Armored Core 6, Sekiro, and Elden Ring are your last 3 games, then I wouldn't be able to confidently say that you lack innovation. To me, Shadow of the Erdtree seems like a fantastic expansion with minimal flaws. To a lot of its audience though, it seems like a complete Trojan horse to the series. And after 1 year of Shadow of the Erdtree's existence, I want to talk about it. I think there's a lot of good to be taken here, that I would like to see in further Souls games. Things that were more fleshed out and expanded upon from the base game, that contribute to a magical experience. But I also think there's a lot of bad that, reflecting success in sales, can be worrying going forward. And I sympathize with that. It seems that instead of improving on the base game's weak points, they were doubled down. Shadow of the Erdtree may only be just more Elden Ring, with not much more to offer, but is that even a bad thing? Shadow of the Erdtree's world and exploration don't suck. In past DLCs, they would usually be linear, matching the base game. But since Elden Ring is the studio's first attempt at the open world formula, Shadow of the Erdtree gets to match this. This leads to progress in certain areas from the base game that we haven't seen before. because of how they have permission to give themselves a vast amount of room instead of focusing on linearity again like they did in the past, while simultaneously not worrying about creating a new game. The elevation of Shadow of the Erdtree's map is probably the most innovative part of the entire DLC, and a good way of showing this. You could look out to one entire unique area above you and below you at the same exact time, which includes the perk of getting you to want to explore whatever you see in the distance. In the base game, this type of varied elevation was sort of present, but not nearly to the same degree as its DLC, and I firmly believe that this is because of the size of both maps. In Elden Ring, while insane varied elevation could be unique, if it was as constant as Shadow of the Erdtree, it could get frustrating. Yet for Shadow of the Erdtree, it makes total sense for why they would do this, as while not small, its map is at the perfect size for this type of idea. And because of this, it may be my favorite overall part of the entire DLC, as in my opinion, it's the closest it ever gets to substantial innovation. But disregarding this point, the beauty of its world is what we were always expecting. The art is one of the best parts of the Souls series already, and yet, in the Elden Ring era, they took this and their mythology to a whole new level. Shadow of the Erdtree doesn't disappoint in acting as a quality addition to what Elden Ring already created. The scenery is absolutely fantastical and insanely pretty, regardless of the fact that Elden Ring doesn't even have real impressive graphics in the first place. It also continues the lore from the base game in a consistently coherent way, and adding to it to make it even more interesting. And this type of quality carries on to the new dungeons, which are also of similar quality to the ones from the base game, with intricate level design, most of the time unique enemies, and quality of puzzles that I would love to see going forward and improved. In fact, the dungeons were my favorite thing to actively explore and complete in all of Shadow of the Erdtree. I wish there were more, but for a DLC the quantity makes sense. There are obviously negatives to be seen, though. Other than elevation, there's no standout innovative feature that its world has to offer in exploration. In Elden Ring, this problem wasn't present, not only because it was the first Souls open world, but because of other seemingly small yet huge positives that were added, like riding Torrent, being able to jump, spirit springs, and much more rewards in general while exploring. Most features like these weren't expanded upon in the DLC, which I would even excuse if it had some sort of other innovation, but it just doesn't. To me, this seems like a missed opportunity. What if we had another rideable magical creature added in other than just Torrent? What if Spirit Springs were more interesting this time around, like being able to move around while using them, which exist in Night Rain? This would seem like a way better decision compared to the only change that they made to Spirit Springs, being that they're sometimes trickier to activate for no apparent reason other than why the hell not. This isn't even to mention how many reused assets this DLC actually includes, that you will see while exploring. It can get tiring to see so many of the same dragons scattered around the map that is designed identically from the base game. Or, if you're not exploring a dungeon, the amount of enemies that you'll also recognize from the base game. NPC quests aren't reused, but feel as confusing and frustrating to follow as they did from the base game, for literally no reason, and I don't think that this is a style choice anymore, it just seems to be something that they're choosing not to improve upon. Then there's assets that the DLC introduces as new, but continues to milk to an extreme that gets frustrating. Like these ghost spirit enemies, for example. I mean, seriously, how many of these do we need? They just aren't interesting. It's also worth saying that while the world you explore is consistently great, some areas go below expectations. The Abyssal Woods, for example. It's awesome first arriving there with an artistically beautiful environment, and a great dungeon at the end with an amazing boss. Yet everything in between seems like it wasn't focused on nearly to the same extent. It's not that it's empty. Empty areas can be done well. This may be controversial, but in my opinion, the finger ruins that have nothing gameplay riveting to offer are actually still fun to explore. When I was riding around with Torrent, I was wondering what the story was here. What are these giant fingers? It was an intrinsic reward, and it never got as boring as the Abyssal Woods were. The difference is with a place like the Abyssal Woods is that you don't have Torrent. This in of itself is interesting, but gets tiring as you go through. The area is visually stunning and interesting, but overstays its welcome, as intrinsic rewards can only last for so long. Unlike a lot of people, I like a lot of what it does at the beginning. The aged Untouchables turning the game into something completely different, with horror and stealth-oriented gameplay. with nothing of further interest until you arrive at its dungeon, which is absolutely fantastic as a whole. If an area in Elden Ring was empty, it was linear and done in a clever way, with an emphasis on only focusing on the environmental storytelling, just like the Finger Ruins from Shadow of the Erdtree. But this DLC's main problem when it comes to exploring is a lack of progression when traversing the world. They did try and fix this with scatter tree fragments, which I almost appreciate. A new and more simple leveling system to help the balancing, and make the progression similar to the base game. Yet while it feels like the intention was to try and incentivize you to explore, it ends up feeling, for lack of better words, really boring, which become worse on subsequent playthroughs. Other than that, it's very rare that you actually find something useful for your build, which can make exploration get somewhat discouraging, regardless of how fun it can be. This problem also hurts the replayability that these games are supposed to possess. In other open world games, a reoccurring source of good rewards exists all over the map. A good example of this are the shrines from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which are everywhere and help exploration produce progression, as every single time you complete at least 4 shrines, you can upgrade your stamina or health. The issue with these though is the lack of random side content that is just fun to explore and tackle for no reason, which makes the shrines get somewhat boring. Elden Ring, and especially Shadow of the Erdtree, seem to have the opposite problem. However it may be, I think adopting a better sense of progression when exploring is needed for the next title, assuming that it'll also be open world. But I think issues like these are easier to dodge if the next title is linear, which is almost what I'm advocating to come out next at this point.
Curse you, Bale!
As if Elden Ring's bosses weren't hard enough, especially for newcomers to the series, Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses take it to an extreme that a lot of us didn't even know existed. Suffice it to say, these bosses may tempt you to exercise your Second Amendment right on your screen, whether it's a $4,000 flat screen television or not. Hell, if you fought him, pre-nerf Consort Radahn may have just turned your living room into an active crime scene by himself. The bosses in this DLC that cause this are very beatable though. They have weaknesses and aren't inherently unfair, just like any other Souls game. Although delayed attacks usually piss me off, a lot of the bosses in this DLC have delayed attacks that are so obviously delayed that it becomes fun to learn perfect timing for dodging. In Elden Ring, delayed attacks would exist, but it would be way less obvious, making it difficult to detect and less fun to learn. Also, the designs of these bosses are fantastic, and match the artistic consistency that the DLC has been meeting up to whatever boss you're going against. It rarely feels like a boss's design or lore isn't thought out well enough. As to FromSoft, it seems that having a beautiful and appropriate aesthetic is as important as riveting gameplay. Bale the Dread is my personal favorite boss I fought in this DLC, and it's when I realized how special it was. For being a bigger boss, I assumed that there would be camera issues, yet FromSoft has seemed to realize how to approach fixing the player's camera that would usually be hindered by such a large enemy. Bale repositions himself a ton. Usually the issue is that when a bigger boss does this, the player ends up underneath it, meaning that you won't be able to see what attacks are coming next. With Bale, however, it's avoidable. If you end up underneath him, it's your fault, rather than the camera's. You can be careful enough to avoid going under him, even if he repositions, which is a brilliant way to solve this issue. He has a lot of AoE attacks which I usually dislike, but these don't bother me when most of them seem like they're more present for intimidation factors rather than a physical advantage in the fight. But this all isn't even the best thing about this boss, the design. Throughout the Souls series, dragons have always been cool, but as cool as a generic dragon that breathes fire can be. Bale has a completely unique design that interests the player in his lore as to why he's older and beat up, going all the way back to his beef with Placidusax. You even do more damage when hitting his weak spots, like his hurt leg. The second phase is also the most cinematic fight we've seen from any Souls game. For me, it's the most cinematic I've ever seen a fight be in a video game. When he first entered his second phase, I practically froze, as I was forced to admire the boss and his stunning arena as well. As for gameplay, his second phase adds AoE attacks that force you to be more careful with how you fight him. It also may seem that punish windows that were present before may be absent because of this, but if you get it down, you realize that they're still present and just harder to navigate, which I think is the best way they could have handled this. While not my favorite, R'Lana is another extremely well done boss. Fighting her feels like sort of a dance, and while I don't like it when bosses feel like this too commonly, she does it in the correct way to me. I'm not sure how I feel about how tanky she is, or her arena though. I wish she was fought somewhere less underwhelming, and that she had some sort of cool dialogue or introduction. She feels unfinished, but the best an unfinished boss can be. Mesmer is one of my other favorite bosses in the DLC. He's arguably the most balanced boss in the entire game, and a keen example of what I was talking about earlier with how I think the late attacks should be implemented. He has one attack where he slides a spear on the ground before suddenly poking the player, with the purpose of punishing panic rolling. At first, this will mess the player up, but if calmed down, you'll discover how much easier it is to dodge this than initially thought. There's a certain timing that's figured out due to him actively moving his spear. In Elden Ring, when a boss would delay an attack, they would barely ever move, which was an issue I believe Shadow of the Erdtree tries to fix. And going forward, I hope that they keep that same idea. His second phase shows how well of a balanced boss he is, since he's arguably more dangerous than his first, but easier at the same time. Doing damage and finding punish windows seems easier, but dodging correctly is more important than ever. There's a lot of other bosses I could talk about, but the last one that I will talk about is Promised Consort Radahn. He's mainly what caused the frustration players would experience that I was referring to earlier. For clarification, I defeated pre-nerf Radahn without any summons, which took me 5 days. Needless to say, he's a pain in the ass. His first phase isn't so bad. His attack where he swings both swords separately and then at the same time used to be almost undodgeable, as his second swing came out too fast. But since then, this has been fixed, and with the absence of this issue, his first phase is really solid. His second phase is infamous for constant AoE attacks, which used to be way worse. It seems impossible to handle. His moveset is mostly the same, but every attack he does is followed by an AoE Light of Mikola attack. This is possible to dodge though, and punish windows are mostly in the same place. The difference is that in the second phase, you have to stay way closer to him. The issue is that with how much AoE attacks there are, it can lag your game, which can give you a disadvantage, along with the fact that Mikola's hair gets in the way and makes it way harder to see Radahn than necessary. But on the bright side, learning him was mostly fun, even if it took me 5 days. The satisfaction of beating this boss is unlike anything I've ever felt before. Unfortunately, there's a reason that one of the biggest complaints of this DLC was the bosses and their difficulty. While a lot of the bosses have consistent, fair balancing, some seem not thought out. To be more specific, weird and frustrating hitboxes or a complete lack of attack windows. Maybe this would be solved if the weapons added in this DLC adapted to the incredibly fast nature of these bosses, but this didn't happen. New sorceries are basically just the old ones but with new names, as there was no innovation here. The same goes for incantations, except when incantations are cool and innovative, they're often useless in actual combat, just like the vast majority of weapons that you'll be finding, as for the most part what makes them unique are their Ash of Wars. And while all of them are really flashy, they have no practicality in any boss I can think of, and are rarely practical during exploration. Going back to bosses, Commander Gaius has completely strange and unreasonable hitboxes and barely any time to ever do damage, with a remembrance reward that isn't worth it. It also doesn't even make sense why he's at the location that he is, since there's no way a mounted person could get in and out of that area. Anyways, with other bosses like Romana, the fight itself is fine, but no second phase for a mandatory boss late game is unreasonable. And this leads to a consistent problem Shadow of the Erdtree has in general, being a lack of cutscenes. Why doesn't Romana or Rolana have their own intro cutscenes? Why don't they have any cutscenes at all? More cutscenes overall could go a long way for an open world Souls game, which I hope they focus on more in the future. The remembrances from a lot of these bosses which act as your reward are also really questionable. I mean, the weapons themselves are cool, and have flashy Ash of Wars, but barely any of them have good practical use in-game, which often ends up being disappointing. Because of this, most of the time your real reward ends up being the runes that you acquire after beating said boss, which don't even matter anyway, as by the time you'll be playing through the DLC, the amount of runes bosses give you won't level you up. I love this game and DLC. I enjoyed it. That's precisely why I critiqued it, as spouting out my thoughts feels healthy. The closest thing I've ever made to a critique before this video was on Dark Souls, in which I don't think I did a bad job, but it was more niche, It wasn't to the same extent that I took this video. Concerning memorability, I think it's something that's missing from Shadow of the Erdtree for a lot of people, due to unusual reasons. If a lot of us tried to answer the question of why, I think we'd answer with what we initially complained about. Bad balancing, and it's an overly hard DLC of a hard game. But in reality, the DLC isn't overly hard. Shadow of the Erdtree is forgettable to its audience because of a lack of innovation, even if it's otherwise great. When it comes to other Souls games DLCs, it feels like they're so much more important and required for their base game. Dark Souls, for example, feels incomplete without Artorias of the Abyss as an expansion, especially after the second half slump that the game suffers from. But Elden Ring doesn't feel the same way. It's nice to have Shadow of the Erdtree as a compliment, but it's possible and common to feel that it's barely more than that. And it all comes down to the stagnation that From decided to pursue. In reality, any issue from the base game was usually doubled down, along with the frustrations with how roughly 50% of the content from the base game was reused. There's not enough newness. Oh, apparently that is an actual word. I'm tired of saying innovation. There's not enough newness to keep this all fresh. And Shadow of the Erdtree is what shows us that. When it comes to the next Souls game, this feels like a must fix to me. Something that absolutely can't be carried over. Yet in a sense, none of this should be Shadow of the Erdtree's fault. If it were DLC to any other game, we probably wouldn't be expecting a great level of innovation like I'm criticizing. It's unlucky in the way that I think its release is the breaking point for how stale the formula is getting. If you're newer to the series, especially like I was as I'm no Souls veteran, then these issues may not bother you, or even occur to you, as it's really just a normal but unlucky DLC. But for fans that have played other Souls games, I understand the innovation complaint more than any other, and will sympathize with it until changes happen going forward. Again, to be fair to From, they've obviously tried innovating much more recently, which unlike a lot of other people that criticize the innovation of this DLC, keeps me optimistic going forward. With the Souls formula, I think they can do more. Make the story more approachable, characters more active, exploration more tied to progression, critical information be taught clearly, etc. Going back to Shadow of the Erdtree, I in no way had a negative experience with it. It's one of my favorite DLCs I've ever played, and considering how good Elden Ring already is, more of it can never inherently be a bad thing. I think it'll age well if the next game in the series does innovate and spice things up. Elden Ring will be remembered well. Although I heavily judged its DLC's negatives in my video, that in of itself almost contributes to why these games are so impressive in the first place. The fact that a lack of substantial innovation is a flaw with a mere DLC goes to show how much we're actually expecting, because of prior quality that's been shown to us, and that is awesome. One can deny that. Bro, is this better? Because I really don't want to have to fix this again.